Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We meet again. We are going to move on to the next lecture, which is going to be for week 6. And the topic for today is going to be refuting arguments. Refuting arguments would be the idea of looking from the point of view of the argument as in something which is not acceptable. And we want to try to look at the weakness of the argument, right? So we are looking into some of the methods of how we would refute the argument based on two things, as mentioned before, premises and the conclusion. All right. Let's go into the first slide for today. Well, there are two ways to refute an argument, which is number one, we have to show that the premise is false or dubious. Number two, we have to show that the conclusion does not follow from the premises. So this comes back to the idea of the argument. So when we mention arguments, what does it mean? Two things, right? It has to be a combination of a conclusion plus premise, right? So because of that, we are looking into how to refute the argument based on the premise and the conclusion. Okay, so the first one, let's have for the first part of refuting arguments, we are going to look into um, the point of view of how to do it from the premise side. All right, so when we mention premise, as I mentioned before, it might be premise or it might be more than one premise in order for you to come up with a piece of argument, right? So say for example, yeah, you have more than one premise, then whatever we want to refute in order to make the argument look weak, we have to use what we call critical premises. Now, critical premises are premises which would be premises which are considered critical in the construction of the premise to prove that the conclusion is something which is true. I'll give you examples here of what it means by a non-critical premise. All right, so let's have a look at this over here, this example, right? Now, if you look at all these four statements, the last one, the fourth one is actually the conclusion. The first three are what we call the premises. The first one, all circles are squares, is false. I believe you would say that is false as well. If you say that is true, I don't know. Uh, I don't know what to say. Right, so ideally the first one is going to be false. So the second one, all squares are rectangles. Well, the idea of a rectangle would be having four sides. So squares would be defined as having four sides. So it is considered a rectangle. So all rectangles are geometrical figures and all squares are geometrical figures. So if you look at point 2 or point 3, then you can safely assume that 4 is actually correct, right? The conclusion is something which is acceptable. Now, this here proves that although number 1 is false, we can say that number 4 is still correct based on the statements of number 2 and number 3, or based on the premises of number 2 and number 3. And because of that, number 1 is not what we call a critical premise. Now, critical premise would be a premise which, if you look at the ideas or if you look at the reasonings of what is being given, it is interrelated to each other. Number 1 is related, but it is not considered a critical premise to number 2, number 3, and number 4. So, showing number 1 is false won't keep number 2 and number 3 from proving number 4 is correct. Right? So this is an example of a non-critical premise, number 1 itself. All right. Now let's have a look at a premise which is considered a critical premise. Okay. So if you look at these three ideas, all presidents live in the White House. Paris Hilton is a president, so Paris Hilton lives in the White House. The second premise itself is false, and because the second premise is false, we cannot in any way say that the conclusion of number 3 is going to be true. And that is what we mean by number 2 being a critical premise. All right. So if you look at what is being explained down here, the second premise is false and enough to refute the argument. The argument fails to prove good reason to accept the conclusion. And that is what it means by being critical upon the premise. So, that is what it means by a critical premise, because it is going to affect the conclusion of the whole argument. And based on that piece of premise, if we can prove that that is wrong, or we can prove that that is untrue, then we can say that the conclusion is going to be untrue as well. All right, so let's carry on with the next one. Now, there are also instances whereby premises are not really interrelated with each other, whereby if we ignore one premise, we can still accept the other premise as showing the conclusion as being true. For example, if you look at this example, right, TJ is a bachelor, TJ is an uncle, so TJ is a male. So number 3 is definitely going to be the conclusion. Number 1 and 2 would be the premises. So if you look at the idea of number 1 and number 2, even if one does not exist and only 2 exist, or vice versa, 2 does not exist or 1 exists, you can still come out to the conclusion that number 3 is true. All right, so does it make sense? Hopefully, yeah. So if you look at the explanation below, since both 1 and 2 provide independent support for falsifying, only one of them will not refute the argument. So what this means is that it does not matter if you have only 1 or you have only 2. It still shows that number 3 is going to be true. All right. Okay. So let's carry on. So if one shows a critical premise to be doubtable, then one has refuted the argument by showing it to be unconvincing. Here, the key element is that you are showing that the critical premise is doubtable. All right, so the critical premise is doubtable. If it is a premise which, is not anyway going to be a critical one, then, we can still accept the conclusion as being so and so. But if it is a critical premise, and if you prove that the critical premise is going to be false, then you can prove that the conclusion is going to be false as well. Okay? All right. So let's carry on. Let's go to the next one. Now, there are also other refutation techniques, such as reducing to the absurd, whereby we show that the truth of a premise would entail something clearly false. Or the second one, present a counterexample. So when you present an exception that shows a premise is false, then ideally you can say that the premise is going to be false. So if you look at the first one, right, reducing to the absurd. So I'll give you an example of this. Say, for example, if you believe, or if you want to argue to the point that, or if you hear someone arguing that all killings are wrong, for example, right? All killings are wrong. So when you talk about killings, then you're talking about taking a life from something, right? So if someone believes that all killing is wrong, and you want to reduce this piece of argument to the absurd, what you do would be you show the truth of the premise would entail something which is clearly false. For example, you might want to mention that what about killing of livestock for us to eat, chicken, cows, for example. Now, if you kill these animals, are you still going to say that these killings are going to be wrong? I don't think so, right? Why? Because you are going to have to eat, and you are going to have to eat meat for protein, for example. And by killing these animals, are you going to replenish yourself of the essential minerals which you need, or the essential sources of energy which you need from your food, right? So in that sense, we can prove something is wrong if you can prove that the premise is false. Okay, so the second one is present a counter example. So if you look at the example, all 20th century presidents were rich, then you can argue back that Harry Truman wasn't rich. So in that sense, the conclusion is not acceptable because the premise itself is not acceptable. All right, is the premise itself is not accurate. Okay. All right, let's carry on. Now, there are also other ways of doing it, such as demonstrating doubt, which we have mentioned before this, when you want to look into a claim, when you want to assume that a claim can be accepted, you're looking from point of view of personal experience, common knowledge, or reputable sources. Now, these are also methods which you can use to demonstrate doubt, you know. So just for example, right, personal experience, if you want to say that, for example, my teacher is a very good teacher, for example, just for example, my teacher is a very good teacher. Now, you might want to reject that piece of premise by saying that, hey, you know what, I've studied with that teacher and I believe that she does not teach well, for example. And by basing that piece of argument on your own personal experience, you are able to reject the premise being given, you know. Or say, for example, if it is from a reputable source, then you know, if you want to say that, hey, you know what, that worker is a very good worker, he does really good stuff, he is really hardworking, he does things which even if you don't tell him to do, he'll do it, say for example, right? And you get from a source saying that he's not that reliable, and that source might be the previous boss, or the previous, you know, his previous, you know, company, or whoever has managed him before, and that person mentions that he is not that hardworking, for example, then based on that source, which is considered reputable, then you can assume that whatever premise has been given before this is not, or not, is not, should be accepted. It's not something which we should accept. All right. Okay. So the second one is not a contradiction either in a single premise or between premises. Show the premises is based on an unwarranted assumption, or personally demonstrate its falsity or dubiousness. Now, I'll just give another example of the last one. Yeah, personally demonstrate its falsity or dubiousness. You know, so if someone tells you that when you are doing something which is on personal point of view, then you are trying to showcase to him, in front of him, if possible, right? So if someone tells you that, you know, all American apples are really crunchy, for example, right? So that is what he mentioned. So if you want to personally demonstrate that it is not crunchy, then maybe you can take an apple from your bag which is not crunchy and which comes from the US, and you can show the person that, hey, you know what, look at this apple, it comes from the US and it's not crunchy. And from there, you are demonstrating personally that the apple, or the argument which your friend just came up with, or the premise which your friend just came up with, is not something which should be accepted. Okay, so that is what it means by personally demonstrating its falsity or dubiousness. Okay, all right, so let's carry on. I think we have another 2 slides or so. So the next one is showing that the conclusion does not follow from the premises. So what this means is that whatever reasonings which have been done based on the premise does not prove that the conclusion is so and so. Whatever the premise, you know, whatever premises which have been done based on the arguer's perception is not enough to prove that the conclusion is as what it is. All right. So to do this, you need to show that the argument is either deductively invalid or inductively weak. As I mentioned before, we are looking from the point of view of the premise not pointing towards the point of the conclusion, and or also the premise as being false. All right. So the most important questions which we want to consider would be: if deductive, does the conclusion follow necessarily from the premises? Are the premises relevant? So is there a fallacy? Are the premises sufficient to support the conclusion? So we are looking at the reasonings, and are the reasonings good enough to say that the conclusion is so and so? Does the argument omit any crucial countervailing evidence? So these are the things which we are going to consider in order to look at the point of view of whether the conclusion is something which can be accepted or not, right? So let's go into this example over here. So get high-speed internet access by satellite. It is fast, reliable, and won't tie up your phone line. So if you look at the premises, the second sentence in this argument, can we assume that we can accept the conclusion of getting high-speed internet access by satellite as something which is acceptable? So if we look at this premise, which is it's fast, reliable, won't tie up your phone lines, um, it's not really good of an evidence to actually prove that we should get high-speed internet access by internet. Why? Because the argument has omitted important evidence that points to a contrary conclusion. What is it? We are looking not just from the point of view of the quality of the internet, but also we are looking at the point of view of whether it is cost-friendly for us to use. Say, for example, if we are to look into the point of view of whether it's acceptable or whether it's good for us to get high-speed internet, then probably we can also think of it from a point of view of the cost, right? So is it expensive? Is it cheap? And if you want to, purchase this service, for example, there might be costs which would uh, which would need you to you might need to pay for other costs for you to have this service beforehand. So these are all the costs which is associated to the purchasing of a high-speed service internet. So if you look at this piece of argument, or if you look at this premise itself, it does not really cover the fact that cost is involved. It's just giving you an idea that it is reliable, it is fast, and ideally it's much better than using phone lines, right? So in that sense, it's not covering everything, and it is omitting some of the important evidence which is going to point out towards the conclusion that it is you should get high-speed internet access. So I think that is all for today's lecture, and I hope you understood whatever was being lectured. So if you have any questions, please do ask your tutors about it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good day.